to Sales Talk, the TV show where we talk all things sales. And I'm really excited today because I very rarely pick up a book about sales. And if I do, I very rarely enjoy it. But I've got to tell you, this book by our guest today, Jim Irvine, the B2B Selling Guide, is by far one of the best sales books I've read, and I really suggest you all buy it. Our guest today is Jim Irvine. Jim, please introduce yourself and tell people a little about yourself.
Hi there. Great introduction, Steve, thanks. I'm Jim Irvine, man and boy sales, from door-to-door selling in the 70s, believe it or not, and then a 43-year career working with corporates, sales, senior sales, leadership, running countries, and then stepped out of the corporate world, and for the last 13, 14 years I've been working with and helping startups. So that was a real change, but you know what? Business is business, and it's exactly the same. As a result of all of that, I then thought it would be worthwhile putting down my thoughts in some form, and that's where the book came from. So delighted to be here today, and delighted to have the conversation.
And I think whenever we speak to people on Sales Talk, and we've been joined by some incredible guests, one of the things that I think you beat me on, Jim, is the years served in B2B sales, and I don't think there are many of those around. So I doff my cap and I listen and I learn. But I think there's so much of that learning comes through the diversity of your sales experience.
Yes.
You know, door to doors in the 70s, which is all about what? Building trust and, you know, having tenacity.
Instant connection, all of those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Skills that I wonder whether we're losing in a more modern world, and maybe we come to that. You know, the corporate environment that probably puts process and structure around some of your sales methodologies. And then I guess the high impact that you have about helping startups. So this richness of experiences really gets you positioned to answer the question in a way that I'm going to ask. B2B sales has been battered by COVID. Battered.
Yep.
And the sellers in this environment are probably dusting themselves down and maybe wondering just what's going on. What do you see as some of these challenges and changes that you would advise them to focus in on to help them improve the results?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question. Let me just say up front that this isn't the first time I've been in this sort of environment. Because once you've done it as long as I have, there have been currency collapses, economic crashes. You may remember the winter of discontent and the 3-day week, trying to work by candlelight because the power and heating was off.
Yeah.
So I've faced that before. I guess there's a couple of things. Everything has changed and nothing has changed. So what's changed? You can't get face-to-face. The personal interrelationship is more complex and more difficult to achieve. But you know what? The selling and the selling model and the selling process, to my view, is exactly the same. If the biggest problem that we all have in life is that the contact that you make with someone is in this format on Zoom or Teams, as opposed to being sitting in the same office, seeing the same person, then I'm happy for that to be the biggest challenge that we ever have. Perhaps more importantly, though, what's making selling more difficult? And it's uncertainty and worry, both for those who are selling, but really critically for those who would typically be those that buy from you. So when I look at that, is the process and are the things that you need to do changed? No. But the focus has to be re-emphasized. So for example, a lot of people talk about building a relationship, quite rightly, getting to a point of trust, and then moving into the selling of what it is they're going to sell. Now, the person that's going to buy has got 1,000 more worries in their head. So the value of what you're going to do has to be much more upfront. The value message, the value positioning, and what you will do to help them in this new world is what has to be front and center. I think the other thing that makes an enormous difference, especially when you don't have the 5-minute chat over coffee before you get into business, and that's one change that I have seen. People are much more direct on Zoom. Yeah, what are we on about? What's happening? In that situation, not just selling, but knowing their world makes an enormous difference. We at Acme have got a great product. Yeah, who cares? Yeah, at Acme, we helped another company that was quite like yours. You might know them. But there we found the following 4 things that were their biggest issues, and we were able to address 3 of them. And I wonder if you're in a similar situation. Creates an environment where the person goes, oh, well, we don't have those, but I'll tell you what we do have, or whatever. So in answer to your question, the world has changed so much. Selling has become more difficult, no question. But the reality of the process and the reality of what you have to do is exactly the same as it was. And is exactly the same as it was during previous economic crashes and during the 3-day week. It's a harder world, but I know startups that are having a hard time. I know startups that are flourishing. And it's a question of the value that they're delivering in the ecosystem that they're selling to.
And I think this is a really important point just to hold for a little longer, because people might perceive B2B as being a very traditional sales operation, and the relationship is fundamentally the key. And many sellers will be saying, yeah, without face-to-face, I can't sell. You know, the days of the milk round with the pilot case full of the brochures, people might still be holding on to that. But you've highlighted a very important point that we've learned about a buyer's preference, is they actually want and expect you to be delivering the insight much earlier than those relationships, the traditional nurturing that physical relationships would allow you to do. And that's a very different mindset when you start to think about your sales process. Because to your point, your sales process begins much, much earlier in a modern selling world than it does in a traditional selling world.
Yes.
And the buying journey, let's just add, probably starts much earlier as well, right?
Yes, because their money is tighter, their criteria for spending money will have been made much stronger. So therefore, you have to touch on that value much earlier. In fact, you could almost think of the value message as a new gatekeeper. Unless you've got that, you won't have the conversation that enables you to build the relationship. So yes, it's a slight reordering, but the message is still the same. But I would say if you're in there just doing more and more calls, trying to talk about the product without referencing their world and what it delivers for their world, then I think you've got an issue.
And that is going to be one of the phrases I already take away from this chat, that the value message might just be the new gatekeeper. And the thought that needs to go behind that is implicit, isn't it, in how much you actually know the problem you're solving, because that's that's got to be one of the more one of the points that the modern seller has to be able to grab hold of and convey very quickly. What actually is that tangible value? What is that problem that I'm solving for you? And whilst we might think, well, that's always been what selling's been about, I think that comment you made about the directness of the sales process is probably also linked with the time that the buyer now affords a seller to actually get their point over.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, that's right. Life is tougher, things are more restricted. Therefore, why would I waste time for someone who wants to talk me through product features?
Yeah.
Take me to what it does for me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it brings back all of those years ago in the 70s. I can't believe I say that still these days. In the 1970s, yeah, before 80% of the audience were even close to being born. I look at the first training course I ever went on, and they battered something into my head that stayed with me all these years. And it's exactly that. If you ever feel yourself getting into the product pitch, just add 3 words. Which means that.
Yeah.
Yes, well, you know, what we do is much more time efficient, which means that for you, it delivers this. It frees your staff to do more productive work. Whatever the benefit is, don't ever stop with the product or the product feature, which means that for the customer. So that's a reasonable starting point for
And it's
anyone who's listening.
even from the 70s to the 2020s, some of the things, at your point, never change.
Yes.
I probably had a slightly different style of trainer. Used to tell me, don't sell the sausage, sell the sizzle. And I think in some ways the point is the same.
Yes. Yeah.
But that then leads me to the buyer's motivation in a way.
Yes.
And we recognise that if we're recognising that the sales process may just have changed mode or emphasis of which means that needs to come out. Our buyer's motivation, and I guess particularly in a B2B sense, might have changed dramatically. They might not be the budget holder any longer. They might have to appropriate funds to different priorities. What do you see as some of the challenges that a B2B seller has in actually getting the buyer in this digital buying world? What do you see as some of the challenges and maybe opportunities of the motivations?
I think, just talking to what we were discussing previously, this year is now a harder year than before. When you come down to it, if you talk about a private sector organization, a company that exists in the commercial world, you're right. Budget responsibility has probably been reduced. The budget sign-off has probably gone further up the organization. And so I'll talk to that value thing again. Those organizations only ever have 3 reasons for actually buying something. At the end of the day, when it comes to the final decision maker, and there are only 3 things. One is, can it help us reduce costs? Second is, can it help us increase either revenues or profits, whatever it is they're going for, or market share? And the third one, can it reduce risk, execution risk, or legislative risk, or whatever? So when you're thinking about engaging, the first thing to think of is, what does my solution do for this type of organization? Now, people have said to me, but that doesn't work. I sell to government, or I sell to local authority, or I sell to health trusts. The only difference in those 3 is that you replace profit or revenues with what does it do to help me reach the mandated goals that I've been given by central government or the public sector governing body, because they all have those every year. Yes. Yeah. So if you say to a local authority, what we do will help you increase the level of processing of returns, then that might help them to get to their objective. So in other words, what I'm saying is, always think in that prism of those 3 things. Is it going to deliver something for them? And which of those is it going to impact? So that's the first thing. Now, that the world of, I don't know what you want to call it, electronic buying or whatever, is a difficult world. But I think there's things that you can do beforehand as well. So first of all, we talked in the first instance about the economy that we're living in. But I think I have a phrase that I've used for about 20 years now called unfair mindshare. So let's say you're a small business and you're a small player and you're up against all these big guys. what can you do to have people recognize you more and for you to be more known to them than might otherwise be the case? And one thing that I've done several times now, I was in an organization that was maybe in third place in the marketplace. And when I joined, I said, okay, what is it makes us unique? What gives us the position? And they said, oh, well, we do this and we do this better than anyone else. And then I went to the website. At that time, you Shopfront. And I said, by 2 measures, we are the market leader in this area. Now, 2 things happened. First of all, people saw the word market leader and traffic increased. But then incredibly, and I'll ask you this question, Steve, competitors started to say, oh, don't listen to them. They're not really the market leader. Now, if you were a buyer, what would be the first thing you would do if your current supplier said, don't listen to them, they're not really the market leader?
Yeah, I mean, totally. It just opens up a different view, right? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So you need to be professional. You need to be accurate in what you do. But then behind that, and you talked about the budget side, who are the people that might be involved in this decision and what are their drivers? You might have one person who is the numbers person on the project or in that company. It's very obvious what they want, but you might have other people who are looking for help or support and they'll have a completely different driver. And you need to make sure that your messaging is right for the person that you're talking to. You can't just do a scattergun. You know, there was a time, economy growing fast, everything going well, people would say, yeah, we'll have a look at this. They don't do that now. So they need to know what they're going to get, and you need to be more clever in the way that you're positioned.
So it's nuanced, right? So I remember when I was very fortunate working with Shell, and we were in China, and that was a real double-digit growth economy the whole time. And I'm not saying that their sales skills were not appropriate, but they certainly were not as refined from the nuance that you've just spoken about here, because it didn't need to compete at that same aggressive level to differentiate and create that unfair mindset. And what I really, I mean, I think those 3 points that you raised, people should not discount that as being just sort of a throwaway list of 3 things. You know, if you can help B2B organization reduce costs, increase revenues, profits, or market share, or reduce the risk, you can only be in one of the corporate's motivations, right? It can't be anywhere else than that. I think then you talk about personal side in a buyer's motivation. And I get that, entirely get that driver's piece. You know, don't talk to somebody in pictures if they like numbers. Let me just, I'm just trying to simplify it to the
But you're absolutely right,
Yeah, and then the only one I would add to that, Jim, is actually the personal motivation of the buyer. So does it help them internally promote themselves to be the unlocker of one of the 3 points you mentioned earlier, right? And then how can you use this to help you in your career? And that is one of the things that goes on in the corporate world that we've both experienced, right?
Yes, and the reality is that when you find someone like that, they can have something that is to their advantage as well as to the business's advantage, not opposing, but they can also become your coach and your supporter.
Yeah, that
because of that dynamic.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, again, those of you that are relatively new to B2B sales, we're probably sharing with you some of the secret sauce here. So do be taking those notes. So we've spoken in part about the decision making changing, and I guess, Jim, what that's doing is making the decision making process more complex, or there's a perception that the decision making is more complex. Normally in a B2B sale, you might target somebody as the decision maker, but the reality is departmental agendas will somehow come and play a part. What do you see around this space that could help the sales folks that are watching this about complex decision making?
Yes. Okay. So there are a number of things that happen in there. The first and most basic mistake that salespeople make is that they find someone and that person is friendly to the message, and then they stick with that person. So the first golden rule is don't stick with one person. Second rule is, and how many times has this happened to you, Steve, in your career? That person says they'll make the decision and you believe them. And until the day the decision is made, and then you find out.
Yeah.
So people want to feel important, but questions like, so if you make the decision, does it go to anyone else to be rubber stamped, or does anyone else get involved? Starts to pull out that. Yeah. I have been in the complex world in situations where two different departments were both funding, and one was very for what I was doing and one was very against.
Wow.
So you have to be really careful and figure out, first of all, who you're talking to. You're absolutely right. What is their agenda? And secondly, what are the corporate, and you're right, the personal wins for going forward? Then, you know, once you've got to that, it's always a great question. In the middle of that, when you're trying to think about what your value is and what you're delivering, to ask 2 or 3 different people, what would you say are the 2 or 3 main priorities just now? What are the things that the company is most desperate to succeed in? What is it you're trying to achieve? If you get very different answers, then you have to sit and think about the strategy. But if you get 1 or 2 that are common, then you can put that in top of the numbers or pictures messaging that you're giving to everybody. So it's a question of being out there. And by the way, I love this world. This is the world of who's there, who's important. By the way, who has the big badge but nobody listens to?
Mm.
Who's not that important, but everyone always gets their advice in that organization. Mm. So there's that whole world of, and by the way, how do you get this? The only thing you can do is engage in conversation and explore, and then compare. So if you manage to get to 4 people who have all agreed that they are the 4 decision makers, fine. Then you look to each of them and to what they need and to what needs to be delivered.
I mean, I think that's, again, that is really solid advice. There's one thing that struck me as you were sharing that, Jim. Decision making isn't a linear process. It can be quite all over the place, right?
Yeah.
So in a B2B sales environment, I guess there's a preparedness to go backwards in the sales process, to be able to go forwards, because you uncover the things you don't know, even with the best of intentions. So don't stick with one person. Seek other people's advice. Sound out what's going on. Is a really important aspect in this B2B space, and I think that's a really good takeaway for a seller, to recognize that there will be different influencers who might not necessarily be the decision maker, but their influence is so significant that it can actually trump the decision maker in this regard.
Yes. And I have seen that happen. Yes. Yeah. You know, you're in an area of someone's expertise, that person is incredibly highly regarded, and the MD or head of division says, well, you know, I know what I think, but you're the expert.
Yeah.
So that they're not there, they're not in the decision-making chart. But as always happens in a room at some point when everyone sits down, and I say this to everyone I speak to, everyone in that room always looks to one person for the final decision. Now, it could be that expert. Most of the time, it's the final decision maker. So how do you access them? How do you get the messaging right for them? And how do you get 3 people in the room all saying, oh, we definitely want to go this way?
So let's go there. Let's go exactly there, because this should be the strength of a B2B sales professional, right? Because this is about what we say we do. This is what we say in lockdown is the reason we're not selling, because I'm not able to nurture those relationships. Now, what you're describing here is an environment of a multi-layer relationship. And I heard you use the word chart. And I guess we're talking about the traditional influence chart. Yep. So the point here is, how do you nurture relationships? What would be some of the advice for the sellers in the virtual room today that are watching this about how do you meaningfully nurture relationships with B2B buyers and influencers and networks and the whole piece?
Yes.
Position yourself as that go-to person.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So more difficult to do if you're into a transactional type of sale, but if you're into something which results in a relationship, always add value outside of what you offer. Always give advice or support or say, oh, I heard this. Is that something you guys have thought about? My go-to story, the one that you know from the book, was a person who was living in a world I could never have survived in. The people who go around the DIY shop saying, do you want any spanners this month? You know, do you want any spanners this month? Do you want any spanners this month? And the person that I knew had simply joined in their community. So he was in the trade associations, he was looking at all the magazines, and he would go in and he never sold. He said, you know, I read about, nothing to do with him, would that be a good idea? And all it took was a couple of conversations where people saw value for their working life coming from that person. Then they became the trusted advisor. Now, in that world, the people who owned those shops actually looked for reasons to get them in. So they were looking for reasons for him to sell them something so they could get that advice. So I would say that's the first thing, knowing about their world. Now today, unlike that day, we have got Google et al. And within that, and this is something for everyone who is listening, I now rely heavily on Google Alerts. I don't know if you use them, but you find a company that you're interested in. Let's say it's a medium-sized company. You tell Google, just look up Google Alerts, that you want to know anything that's in the news about them, that's about the marketplace they're operating in, or that they have announced or said they're going to do. And Google feeds that to you daily, weekly, monthly. How hard is that? To then have a conversation with them about their world rather than going, oh, our product is now 2% faster. Who cares? Yeah. But you're adding value to their world and then introducing what you're selling. So that is something that you can do. But the thing you have to do in all of that is to be yourself. Don't try and be something else. You know, be yourself. And one of the things I have found very good is once I've established a relationship and people are liking that and they say, can you do this? Just look them in the eyes and say, no, we can't. And the amount of respect you get from people who have a procession of salespeople telling them they can do everything. When you say, we can't do that, or I don't know, but let me find out and come back to you. And in fact, where communication with an organization is quite restricted or difficult, I would often use that. I would know the answer, but I would say I didn't know and say, can I call you again tomorrow? Yeah. And because it's their question, they say yes. And then you have an additional conversation above that, which they expected to have.
So that always would give you that reason to have the next logical step in the conversation. Yes. Totally. I mean, I think, again, there's a real couple of nuggets for a traditional B2B seller that's moving to a more modern sales world.
Yes. Yes.
Adding value outside your area has got to be easier to do because of technology, because of the wealth of information. Know about people's worlds, connect people, and add value through that. Be authentic, be yourself, become trusted, and always have that next step to be able to follow up. And I think this is a premise that back to probably your very early point, your very first point, in fact, that if the only problem is that we have to build relationships via this medium, it's not really a problem, because doing all of those things are entirely congruent with what you said earlier. And they're all accessible. They're potentially now all digital, but they are all immediate, and you're able to nurture those relationships as we go.
Yes, absolutely.
So we have covered in this, would you believe, 30 minutes, we have covered an incredible amount of content. And I'm going to ask you, Jim, to do the impossible and just give your 3 top tips to the audience.
Okay. In selling, people buy for the value that they get. They don't wake up in the morning and say they want to buy your product. They buy for what you will do to help them do something better. Those 3 factors that I've talked about. Number 1. Number 2, research and know the sector you're selling into, research and know what their problems, what their challenges are. If you know what a company's top 3 goals are for the year, then you fit what you've got into that. And you can use their language. That's the second one. And the third is always ask questions. And when you think you've asked all the questions, ask more. I worked for a company, just to finish off, and I still smile thinking about it. Every so often you would go in for meetings with your manager, as we've all done. And their game, if you could call it that, was the manager would look at his watch as you walked in and would see how long it was before you mentioned your company or the product. Could you have the first half hour just talking about their business, their marketplace, their situation, their priorities? And if you get that first half hour, do you know what? The buyer already thought it was a good meeting. Now, people might not believe that, but the buyers went, oh, these guys are interested. We're having a great conversation. This is what I want. And then everything else flows far more easily. So those would be 3 things that I would suggest. Wow.
I mean, they are incredibly powerful, but a great example at the end about actually putting it into practice. Now, it will be, it's easy for me to say that there is much more of this wisdom and experience in Jim's book. And what's really important about Jim's book is not only does it give you examples, as hopefully you can see on the page, but actually you've got note pages. So it's I call it a workbook book, which actually for me is one of the nice things of this. But Jim, just in closing, and thank you so much for joining me today. Just tell people where they can find you and where they can get this.
Okay. And the book is available as a hard copy, as you have, from Amazon. It's available in soft copy from most of the online vendors, and it's available as an ebook from Audible. And I'm contactable, first of all, on LinkedIn. I was in early, so I'm just Jim Irvine. It's all very straightforward. And also, there's a website for the book and for me, which is all the W's, B2B Selling Guidebook.com. And that's us.
Fantastic. So just one more show of it there. Don't miss out. And Jim, thank you again for joining me and sharing so much with the Sales Talk audience. So that's the end of the episode this time around. Please just subscribe if you want to see more from previous guests and future guests on Sales Talk, where we have the TV show that talks about all things sales. We'll see you next time.